All right, diving in today, folks, and we're tackling, the book of Philemon,
Philemon.
Philemon, which you guys wanted to hear about. So we're going deep on it,
Yeah.
and thankfully, we've got an expert here to help us navigate this thing.
Absolutely happy to be here.
I'm glad you're here too.
Yeah, Philemon, it's just one page, in the Bible,
It's short.
but so much packed in there.
Yeah, so much depth to cover.
Yeah.
And we got to start with the basics. It's a
Yeah.
letter from Paul,
Right. Apostle Paul, yeah.
the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
But it's not like
Not a typical
your typical letter from Paul.
No, not like Romans or Galatians,
Yeah, exactly.
That's
like
a
this.
personal letter.
Much more personal.
Yeah.
And it's to this guy, Philemon, who's a what is he? A wealthy Christian?
Yeah, he was a wealthy Christian, probably living in Colossae, had a house church.
A house church? Okay, so this is like early church stuff.
Very early church, yeah.
Okay, interesting. And the letters about this this runaway slave,
Onesimus.
Onesimus.
Yeah, who we actually don't know a ton about other than what Paul tells us in the letter.
Right. Which is always interesting when we're dealing with these ancient texts. We got to read between the lines and all that.
Absolutely. Use our historical imagination.
Yeah, for sure. But so Onesimus is a runaway, and he meets Paul.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really fascinating, right? You've got a runaway slave fleeing probably for his life.
Dangerous stuff.
Oh, incredibly dangerous. And he encounters Paul, this prominent figure in the early Christian movement.
Yeah, I mean, Paul had been, imprisoned, shipwrecked, like he'd been through it.
He'd seen a lot.
Yeah.
So they meet, and somehow Onesimus becomes a Christian.
Wow.
Under Paul's guidance.
Under Paul's mentorship.
Think about that for a second.
Yeah.
In Roman society, a slave was property.
Yeah, not even a person, really.
Right. They didn't have the same rights, the same dignity.
So for Onesimus to become a Christian,
It's radical.
yeah, it totally upends the social order.
Exactly. And that's what makes Philemon so powerful.
Okay, so now we've got Paul writing to Philemon, right? He's got to send Onesimus back.
He does.
Is he just returning a runaway? Is that what this is?
That's what's so interesting. He is sending Onesimus back to Philemon, but
But there's a catch.
there's a huge catch.
A huge catch.
He's not sending him back as a runaway slave,
Okay.
but as a brother in Christ.
No, that's different.
Yeah, he's asking Philemon to forgive Onesimus.
To forgive him.
Yes, and to welcome him back, not as property, but as a fellow believer and equal in their faith.
That's a big ask.
Huge.
I mean, what if Philemon just said no?
Exactly. And we don't know for sure what Philemon did.
Yeah.
The letter doesn't tell us.
We don't get that ending.
No, which is fascinating in itself.
Yeah.
It's like Paul leaves it open for us to think about.
It's almost like he wants us to ask that question.
Right. Like, what would we do in Philemon's shoes?
Yeah, some scholars even argue this is Paul's way of subtly challenging the whole Roman system of slavery.
Right. Because if your faith transcends social hierarchy, then how can you justify owning another human being?
It's a radical concept for the time.
Absolutely radical.
And it's interesting, the language Paul uses, he calls Onesimus his son, his very heart.
Powerful words.
Yeah, you can really feel the depth of their connection.
It shows how much Paul cares for Onesimus, how much he believes in his transformation.
He's advocating for him, right?
Totally. And he does it so cleverly. He uses this brilliant wordplay, connecting financial debt with spiritual forgiveness.
Okay, break that down for me.
Sure. So Paul basically says that any wrong Onesimus has done, Paul will cover it.
You'll pay it back.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
But then he says, but Philemon, out of love, should forgive the debt, meaning forgive Onesimus.
Oh, I get it. So he's tying those two things together, the money and the forgiveness.
Precisely. And that's just one example of how Paul uses language to make his case.
Man, Paul was a good writer.
He was a master.
A master, yeah. And it's just wild that we don't know how it ended. Did Philemon forgive Onesimus?
We don't.
Did he welcome him back as a brother?
It's left open. And I
Right.
think that's what makes Philemon so powerful, so enduring.
I think you're right. It forces us to wrestle with these complex issues.
Forgiveness, reconciliation, social justice.
Themes that are still so relevant today.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Philemon, it really leaves me thinking about where we draw those lines, between us and them.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Are there places in our own lives where we need to hear Paul's call? That call for radical, love-driven equality, just like Philemon did.
That's something for all of us to consider for sure.
It is. And on that note, we'll leave it there, folks. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Philemon.
It's been a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.